Cabezas, and it's a open economy Hank model. Luis, the floor is yours.
Hi. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to these amazing conferences. Today I will present large devaluations, heterogeneous consumption adjustment, and macroeconomic implications. So let me start by the motivation of this paper. This paper is motivated by large devaluations that are quite common phenomenon in emerging markets. This is mainly related to sudden stop that usually affect those economies. A well-established fact in this type of events is that there is a huge collapse in aggregate consumption. However, there is less evidence about what happened with tradable and non-tradable consumption during those episodes. So this paper tackles this type of phenomenon, what happened with the relative consumption. Using large exchange rate devaluations, this paper studies how household consumption decisions help us to understand their propagation across economic sectors. Let me give you an overview, a brief overview of the paper. The paper has two main parts. One is, the first one is a theoretical part, and then I will present you a more empirical part. The model that I developed is a Hank model, and this model is, you can think about a small open economy model with two sectors, tradable and non-tradable. In the textbook model, you have representative agents, so the extensions of this model you can think about is first with household heterogeneity, so raising that assumption of representative agent. And the second one is the models usually assume that consumers have a homothetic CES preference. So I also extend that assumption, and this model includes generalized non-homothetic CES preference. I will tell you in a second why those two ingredients are important. And the main, one of the main results of the theoretical part of the model is that we need the interaction between heterogeneity at the household level and non-homotheicities in order to reconcile empirical evidence. What I mean by empirical evidence is aggregate and sectoral level consumption. You need both devices at the same time in order to explain them. And the second important result is associated with there is asymmetric spillovers across sectors when there is a shock, a sectoral shock. In this case, when we have a large exchange rate devaluation, so a change in relative prices, the crisis propagate in an asymmetric wave to the non-tradable sector. And this, the impact will be higher when the crisis start in the tradable sector. And then I go to the empirical evidence. First, I chose some aggregate empirical evidence, and the first result is that during those episodes of large devaluations, think about Mexico in 1994 or Asian crisis, Thailand in 1997, there is a disconnection between relative prices and relative consumption. And the disconnection is related to the homothetic CES preferences, only has a price effect that is not able to explain the relative consumption decline. Basically, what I will show you is that in those episodes, non-tradable consumption declined by more than tradable consumption. That is what we expect during large devaluations. And then I go to household level evidence. I open up the results in Mexico 1994 using household survey data, and I show that this decline in consumption is heterogeneous across household, and the decline in non-tradable consumption is mainly motivated by high-income household. And also there is strong evidence of non-homotheicities, mainly motivated by differences in expenditure shares across the income distribution. In the next of the talk, I will talk first with the model, then empirical evidence, and finally I will show you some simulations and the quantitative results. So the motivation for the model, I tell you some part at the beginning. Existing small open economy model are representative agent with homothetic CES preferences, but in practice we know that In emerging markets, there is a strong inequality in consumption. The marginal propensities to consume are quite higher than zero. And also, we have strong evidence that homotheticity is a strong assumption, mainly related to the differences in expenditure shares across the income distribution. So here the focus is on household heterogeneity and insurable idiosyncratic income risk and relative consumption changes. Let me give you the model outline. The main modifications in a standard textbook small open economy two-sector model is at the household level. So household face idiosyncratic income risk, and they also face borrowing constraints, and the preferences are not Koch-Douglas or homothetic CES. Instead of that, I will show you those type of generalized non-homothetic CS preferences and the nice results that they provide. And the rest of the model is, as I say, two-sector non-tradable. Non-tradable is the only sector that is producing in this economy. So I simplify the tradable sector, and the tradable sector is only an endowment. Basically, it works as a demand shifter in the economy. And two assumptions are the price and wage rigidities in this economy. The main and the most important assumption is wage rigidities, because they produce an important income effect that I will show you in a second. Non-tradable price rigidities only in order to improve the calibration. And incomplete asset markets. So here is the household. As I tell you, this is the main modifications in the standard model. So a household consume non-tradable. This is PN at price N, CN consumption of non-tradable. They consume tradables at price PT, and they have access to a domestic currency asset, nominal asset. And they also receive income from labor. This is coming from non-tradable sector, and they have an endowment of tradable goods. And then there comes the non-homothetic CS preferences, that this is the summation. There is a weight scale, omega J, for non-tradable and tradable. And then this C is an implicit consumption aggregator that is defined by this parameter gamma J. This is an important parameter. Then I will show you that those differs across those parameters differs across non-tradable and tradable, and the empirical results, I will show you that actually non-tradable have higher income elasticities than tradable consumption. And then the small c is tradable and non-tradable sectoral consumption. And finally, a borrowing constraint. So this is the main part of the modifications in the model. We have idiosyncratic income risk in variable C, and then the non-homothetic CS preference. If both parameters J are equal to 1, then we can take out of the summation the consumption, and we return to the standard homothetic CS preference. I will give you a little bit more intuition about what are the implications of those preferences. First, expenditure share changes across the income distribution, and now the implicit consumption aggregator will appear across the different expenditure shares. So basically, low-income household will have different expenditure share in tradable and non-tradable than the high-income household. In data, in practice, we see in the case of Mexico and in the main part of the countries that households spend, low-income households spend more on tradable, and high-income households spend more on non-tradable, services mainly. And then I just a reminder about what are the homothetic CS preferences in this case. In this case, there is no any consumption or real income associated with prices. And so they only depend on relative prices. So basically, if we think about the income distribution, the expenditure share across the income distribution is constant. And then I disaggregate the change in sectoral level consumption. So let's think about tradable and non-tradable. It depends on a price effect, so basically relative price, and on an income effect. And this income effect is affected by these income elasticities. This expectator E in aggregate prices means that this is a weighted average across expenditure shares of the different prices at the household level. So it's household level inflation. If we think about relative changes in consumption, so here I am showing you tradable and non-tradable. If we think about the difference, if both elasticities are the same, then if I do the difference between non-tradable and tradable, the income effect disappears and there is no any income effect, and we only have price effect. And this is one of the propositions in the model. When we compare relative consumption, we only have price effect in homothetic CS preference. However, now in non-homothetic CS preference, we have a parameter that allows us to have different income effect. The rest of the model is quite standard. We have production only in non-tradable, a Phillips curve, and wage rigidity is also in a wage Phillips type of wage Phillips curve. Tradable sector is endowment, as I just tell you, and law of one price holds. So basically, tradable price is the same as nominal exchange rate. Then monetary policy is governed by a standard Taylor rule that only depends on prices. A UIP condition also holds. So this is the most simple version of any small open economy model. Now I will show you some results of the model. The first model implication is related to, let's think about exchange rate, a real exchange rate shock, and what is the effect on aggregate consumption. So the change in aggregate consumption depends on real income channel and a multiplier. This result was shown by Auclair and some co-author in a recent paper, and we extend and generalize that result. And in the case of non-homothetic CS preferences, we will have that multiplier will be different, particularly for the calibrations that I will show you. The multiplier is higher than in the standard case, so the amplification of exchange rate shock will be quite higher under those preferences. This result also allows us to understand what is the difference between a representative agent and a heterogeneous agent model. In this case, we have that real income channel is affected by expenditure share in non-tradables and also by marginal propensities to consume, that is the variable M that is there. And in representative agents model, these marginal propensities to consume are close to zero, so basically the real income channel is absent in representative agent or two-agent model, and that is the reason why we observe in previous literature that when we don't have additional financial friction in an open economy model, we don't have a contractionary devaluation in the economy. And so if we return to the standard case with homothetic CS preference, so basically parameters gamma A and gamma N and gamma T are equal to 1, we have a lower level of amplification in consumption decline after a large exchange rate devaluation.
Sorry, this is the entire path, right, of consumption?
Entire path of consumption.
All water.
Exactly. It's the intertemporal aggregation of that. Yeah, I am skipping all the math details here to simplify them. Thank you. The second model implication is what is the income and price effect, how they determine the relative price consumption. Basically, In this case, we will have that consumption of tradable and non-tradable decline. But in the case of consumption of non-tradable, as I will show you in a second, decline by more. So basically, this difference is positive. But what we observe during a large exchange rate devaluations is a higher increase in tradable prices. In the case of Mexico, this increase in relative prices about of minus 20%. So the only way to reconcile the relative price change with the relative consumption change is with a negative price. Is with a negative elasticity of substitution. So with homothetic CS preference, that is not possible. We have only price effect, but with non-homothetic CS preference, we have a price and income effect. And actually, I show in a proposition that there is a threshold level equal to rho star. After that threshold, the income effects overcome price effect, and that is the reason why we observe during large devaluations a stronger decline in non-tradable consumption than in tradable consumption. Finally, the third model implication is that under this setup, when we have different income elasticities, particularly higher non-tradable income elasticity, there is an asymmetric spillover across economic sector, particularly when the shock starts in the tradable sector, the non-tradable sector is more affected. Now let me show you some empirical evidence. First, this is national account data, Mexico, Thailand, and Iceland. In the case of, and in red, there is non-tradable, in blue is tradable consumption. This is annual data, and in the case of Mexico, after 1 year, as I just told you, non-tradable consumption declined by more than tradable consumption. This is unexpected in terms of if we have a huge exchange rate devaluation, we expect that consumption of tradable declines by a lot. Similar evidence is support this is not a particular case. This was the case also for Thailand in 1997 and in Iceland in some sense in the 2008 crisis. As I told you some minutes ago, the only way to reconcile this evidence with homothetic CS preference is with a negative elasticity of substitution. At the household level, we have the Mexico case in 1994. This is household level data, and we have heterogeneous consumption adjustment, and this is the aggregate result is mainly motivated by high-income households that concentrate the main part of the decline in this economy. This is expenditure share in tradable consumption. Over the x-axis, we have income decile, and we can see that for low-income household, this is first decile, about 80% of the expenditure in tradable is in tradable, and in the case of high-income decile, we have almost the opposite. 60% or 50% is in non-tradable. So this is a strong evidence of non-homotheicities in this economy, as if we have homothetic CS preference, we expect a flat line over the distribution. Some estimation in order to get the income elasticities, and basically what I show is that non-tradable income elasticity is quite higher than tradable income elasticity, and this support the theoretical result that I just told you. And now what I do is a simulation of the model. So basically what I simulate is the increase in interest rate in the United States in the 1994 before the large devaluation started, and then I show you the difference between homothetic and non-homothetic tradable and non-tradable consumption. What is the evolution with this model? The calibration, this is the panel A replicates the figure that I just showed you. In blue line is homothetic preference. Black line is the model calibrated with non-homothetic CS. And also consumption share is quite good at yes. Those are the simulations for the model. In red, we have non-tradable, in blue, tradable. Segmented lines are for homothetic CS preference. So basically, we have the counterfactual result that I just tell you that we have observed in the data, but it's not reconciling the model. In the case of non-homothetic CS preference, I am not trying to force the calibration, but if I push more, I got same consumption as in the data. Expenditure share are similar as we observe in the data. This is after the, as I told you, the increase in foreign exchange and foreign interest rates. And finally, the final result that I have to show you is the policy implication. Basically, in the previous case, we assumed that there is a flexible exchange rate, but now I push the economy to go from free floater to keep the exchange rate fixed. And in that case, if we fix the exchange rate instead of let freely floating as Mexico did in December 1994, we have that consumption decline by half of what we observe in the data. So basically, this price effect forced an additional decline in income effect, and basically this was a real income effect because the wage rigidity is paying the real income. So some final remarks. Non-tradable consumption also strongly declines during large devaluations. Asymmetric spillovers can be one of the sources of this large decline in non-tradable consumption in Mexico in 1994. And there is an important interaction between non-homotheticities and heterogeneity that helps to explain sectoral and aggregate consumption. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Now, Marcos, you may come here to present your discussion. 10 minutes, please.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me to discuss this great paper by Luis. And I'll start my discussion with a brief summary of what I think are the most important parts of the paper. This paper has a lot of things, and the idea here is to summarize what I think are the most relevant results. So, as Luis showed you, I think the main motivation for this paper is this puzzling fact that during sudden stop episodes, the consumption of non-tradable falls relatively more than the consumption of tradables, at least for Mexico and Thailand, and it falls as much as tradables in Iceland, 2028. And this is despite the fact that relative price of non-tradable drop relative to tradable due to exchange rate depreciation. And as he argues very well in the paper, this cannot be explained using our standard theories in this literature. So the second important fact that he documents in the paper, and here this is my drawing of his figure 6 in the paper, which shows the change in consumption of tradables in the blue line and non-tradables in the red line for different income groups, so splitting households based on their income levels. And what you can see from this picture is that the puzzle is explained by the consumption behavior of the rich households. Those are the ones who show a higher drop in non-tradables relative to tradables. And if you look at the consumption of the poor households, those are consistent with the standard theories. And then the last, I think, important evidence here is there's consumption shares of tradable goods. And as he shows, this expenditure shares decreases with income. So we can interpret tradables as necessities, as non-tradables as luxuries. And that's what he does. So motivated by this evidence, he then extends the standard small open economy Hank model to allow for non-homothetic preferences over tradables and non-tradables. He then estimates these new parameters of the model using state-of-the-art methods by Comine and co-authors. And then he used the calibrated model to study a sudden stop episode, focusing on the Mexico episode, and modeling the shock as an exogenous shock to the international real interest rate. And finally, this is also the main results of the model. So here are the consumption responses to this real rate shock in non-tradables in red and tradables in blue. And what you can see is that the calibrated model is able to account for this large decline in non-tradables, whereas the shaded dotted line, which represents the response in the homothetic model, is unable to get close to the response of non-tradable to this shock. And finally, he also finds that in his baseline model with non-homothetic preferences, this aggregate shock is amplified. So the consumption drop is way larger than the drop in the standard model. So now moving to my comments, I only have 2 comments, and the first one is this choice of modeling the sudden stop episode as a shock to the international interest rate. This is well known. It's a simple way of capturing the sudden stop episode. So it generates qualitatively lower income, higher interest rates, depreciation, inflation. But what is crucial here is that this shock match quantitatively the aggregate dynamics of the relevant variables. And especially, I pointed 3 variables which are very important in the consumption response, which are real interest rates, which the model matches by construction. That's the exogenous shock used in the paper. But it's also important to know and to contrast the predictions of the model with what we observe in the crisis in Mexico. What happened to output, and we don't know in the paper, and what happened to relative prices that I just learned. Apparently, the response of relative prices is pretty similar to the observed in the data, but I think that wasn't in the paper I received. And my suggestion here is that comparing the predictions of the model, validating the model with respect to these other 2 variables, I think would add a lot of value to the paper. And the second is a minor comment on the mechanisms driving consumption dynamics in the model. So when we work with models of demand with non-homothetic preferences, what happens is these models imply this tight connection between 2 very important elasticities: income elasticity and the elasticity of intertemporal substitution. And this is the idea that luxuries are easier to postpone. So goods with a higher income elasticity are also goods that will have, in the model, a higher elasticity of intertemporal substitution. So the direct effect of a shock to interest rates is going to be bigger on luxuries. And here, luxuries are the non-tradables. Hence, the direct effect on this exogenous interest already would generate the expected result And going back, so again, I think it would be interesting on the following the Hank tradition on separating direct versus indirect effects. It would be interesting to see quantitatively the role of the change in income and relative prices in generating this differential response of tradables and non-tradables. So to conclude, this is a great paper, very well executed. It presents new facts. It model, we're using state-of-the-art calibration, and it shows these very interesting results. So it shows the importance, to me, that's I think the main takeaway, is it shows the importance of non-homotheticity in understanding consumption dynamics during sudden stops. And I think you would benefit from validation of the model with aggregate income and price dynamics in Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcos. Luis, you may reply if you want.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comments. Very welcome. I think in the main part of the paper, I don't have the results for aggregate output. What I actually have in the appendix of the model is something that we expect in this type of episode is current account reversal. So that is something that I provide extensive evidence that is something that the model replies and is something expected and not easy to obtain in this type of models. And the other comment related to relative prices is that the indicator that I follow is real exchange, real wages. In this model, real wages are quite similar, or we can establish a close map with the real exchange rate. So that is the indicator that I try to match with the calibration of the model. So very, very welcome those results. And the other result related to the if and only if comment related with income elasticity and elasticity of intertemporal substitution, that is a quite important issue. It's an important issue in this paper because basically something that I didn't discuss today is that the Euler equation is modified with this type of preferences, and this implies that there is also a higher intertemporal substitution in the model. So this type of preference helps us to explain large shocks or tail events are more difficult to calibrate large swings of the economy during normal times.
But to be clear, I don't think it's an issue. I think it's a property of the model. Maybe, and you can study even the implications of that. You could even test that if actually the consumption of tradables versus non-tradables in response to an interest rate shock in the data differs or not. I don't know. It's just I just want to clarify. I don't think that's an issue. It's just a property.
Thank you. Maybe one last point to highlight related to that topic is that in proposition 2 that I just showed, this is a new result. It wasn't present in the original version of the paper. I show a result that there is basically a threshold when this type of preference becomes relevant, and this is associated with a real income effect. So basically, when you have large oscillations in real income, this income effect appears and overcomes the price effect that can be present in main part of those type of episodes. Thank you so much.
Okay, we have now time for questions from the audience. Alex.
Okay. Thank you very much, Luis, for the presentation. It's very interesting. a paper that I'll definitely read. I think it's more than I thought. Maybe you can comment on my comment. Usually these episodes of sudden stops, they're linked to sudden stop of capital flows, right? And from what I understood, you kind of proxy that for a high increase in the foreign interest rate. But in your model, it seems like you're shutting down the imperfect capital mobility channel, because you're assuming UIP, right? So I was wondering how important that channel would actually be, because if you had that channel operating, you'd also have sort of a covariance between consumption growth and some factor, like probably the income growth that would probably generate that would probably link to the shock as well. Maybe you could explicitly have a shock to income that would affect, this component. Going back to the case of Mexico in 1994, is there a motivation for this hypothesis also of using the foreign interest rate as the channel, the origin of the shock? That's another question. That's a more proper question. But the first one is a sort of a doubt. I would like to see your views on this comment. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment. I will. The motivation of an increase, that was the trigger, basically. There is some discussion about that. That was the trigger related to with other political facts that happened to that time. As you say, exactly, I am trying to isolate the perfect capital mobility, because that is another friction that eventually helped to explain another part of what happened on those type of episodes, and that is the reason why I just saying that current account reversal is something that we can calibrate in the model. So this is basically the counterpart to net foreign asset position in the economy, and in that sense, although we don't have a well-developed financial market in the model, there is some evidence that the model replicate this part of the evidence with the current account reversal. And thank you for your comment.
Okay. Anyone has any more questions from the audience? Yes, the mic.
Well, I don't know if I misunderstood your model, but it seems to me that there is no asset accumulation or investment dynamics when the saving rate changes in your model. Is that right?
Right. There is no investment in this version of the model. There is no physical capital accumulation. There is only financial asset accumulation by household. So basically, when you have the sudden spike in the interest rate, you have the UIP condition there, and that adjusts the prices and generates the large devaluation in relative prices in the economy. We can calibrate the relative prices, not the absolute level of prices in this type of model.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And you don't have any more time for an additional question. So Marcos is still here. So the floor is yours, Marcos. Marcos will present his paper, Unequal Business Cycle.
So in this paper, I revisit a classic question in macroeconomics of whether recessions disproportionately hurt low-skilled workers. And I revisit this question taking into account the following facts. So first, the fact that low-skilled workers have higher income cyclicality, which is something that already have been studied in other papers. The second, that these workers also have lower savings. And third, which is something I document in this paper, the fact that low-skilled workers have lower consumption cyclicality, so their consumption is more stable despite having higher income cyclicality and lower savings. This is important because the models used in this literature predict that if workers have higher income cyclicality and lower savings, they would tend to be more constrained, and these models would imply that these workers will have higher consumption cyclicality instead of what we observe in the data. And I mean, the reason for this discrepancy and what I argue in this paper is the fact that households consume very different baskets. In particular, I document not only that consumption is less cyclical or more stable for low-skilled workers, but that this difference is accounted by the fact that high-skilled workers who are richer, they consume relatively more luxury goods. And luxuries are the more cyclical component of consumption. So, motivated by these facts, I extend the standard incomplete markets model to allow for non-homothetic preferences. So there'll be luxuries and necessities. And as I mentioned in my discussion, luxuries are also going to be easier to adjust intertemporally. So, and that would imply that the richer is the household, the higher is going to be his elasticity of intertemporal substitution because of his choice of consumption baskets. And then I show that the model is consistent with the evidence on consumption cyclicality, and in particular, because in recessions, these richer households will choose to postpone the consumption of luxury goods. That's the intuition. And then I use the model to evaluate the welfare cost of recessions, and I find that this cost is more than 3 times larger for low-skilled workers, despite their more stable consumption. And again, this is explained because people consume different baskets, and it's less costly to reduce the consumption of luxury goods, or to postpone the consumption of those goods. So highlighting that the composition of consumption baskets is crucial for any welfare analysis. So the outline for my talk today, I'll first talk briefly about the data, then I'll show you the model and the quantitative results. Okay, so on the data, I use consumption data from the CX survey for the US, and I compute for each household their consumption change at time t, his semi-annual consumption change for a given time t, and then I estimate or I project this these individual consumption changes into a measure of a cycle that I use different measures. So I use ZT, right? So I use aggregate consumption, unemployment rate, and an indicator of a recession to capture this cyclical component. I also control for some observables, and I interact this cyclical variable with a dummy for whether the individual has a college degree. So whether the individual is what I'm calling high skill. So to estimate this differential consumption cyclicality. And here are the main results. So what I find is that when aggregate consumption, what this table is showing, when the aggregate consumption increases by 1%, consumption on average for low-skilled workers increased by 0.9%, and the consumption of high-skilled workers increased by 1.1%, or 0.21% higher. When we use the other measures of this cyclical component, the unemployment rate or the recession indicator, I find similar results. So when you have a recession or when unemployment rate goes up, consumption falls, and it falls by more for the more educated or the high-skilled workers. So this is, I interpret this as evidence that consumption is more cyclical for high-skilled. So next, I split the aggregate consumption basket into individual consumption categories, and I estimate what I'm calling here the luxury index, which is how these budget shares of these categories vary with household income. And then I rank individual consumption categories based on this luxury index. So here, as you might expect, food at home is the least luxurious category, is the more essential one. Electricity, gasoline, telephone services, etc. And in the end of the list, we have, and this is excluding durables, so only non-durables and services. Then food away from home, entertainment, this is like restaurants, are the most luxurious components of consumption within non-durables and services. So then, I define two broad categories of consumption, what I'm calling here necessities, which are these categories with the lowest luxury index, such as food at home, electricity and gasoline, and I'm calling luxuries the rest. And then I'm going to re-estimate that simple linear regression, excluding luxuries from the construction of the consumption, individual consumption measures. And this is what I find. So the first two columns in this table are the same two columns from the table I showed you before. And the last two columns are the results when we exclude luxury components from our measure of consumption. And what we find is that once you exclude this luxury consumption, the luxury part of the consumption, then there's no more difference in consumption cyclicality between high and low skilled workers. And I take this as evidence that this difference is accounted by expenditure on luxuries. So the cutoff I used to separate those two baskets, what I call luxuries and necessity, was arbitrary. So what I do here is to use my ranking to construct this differential consumption sensitivity. Now I'm using the unemployment rate as a measure of cycle, and I exclude the luxury goods component by component. So the point in the left is the first result when you include all consumption categories, and what we find is that this beta coefficient, which is capturing this differential consumption cyclicality, is very negative. And once we exclude these more luxurious categories, this differential cyclicality decreases and converges to zero. So this is showing that this difference disappears when we exclude the more luxurious component of consumption. Okay, so this is the summary of the empirical part of the paper. So low-skilled workers exhibit lower consumption cyclicality, which is accounted by difference in their consumption baskets. And I find similar results using different measures of consumption and different ways of estimating this cyclicality or volatility of consumption. And also, as I mentioned, they also have higher income cyclicality. So now going to the model, as I mentioned, I extend this standard model used in this literature, Bewley-Iagari heterogeneous agent models, with aggregate TFP shock. This is going to be the only shock in the model, and I introduce it as an MIT shock, and I extend this model to allow for these non-homothetic preferences over luxuries and necessities. So there is going to be ex ante heterogeneity. So the model is going to be, there's going to be two types, low skill and high skill, and they're going to differ in their idiosyncratic income process, their exposure to aggregate shocks. So this is to capture the fact that income is more volatile for the low-skilled workers. And also they're going to differ in their returns to savings. And this is for the model to be able to match their savings rates, which are different. And firms are competitive, very simple, and there's going to be a government taxing and transferring resources. So here's the problem of the households. And all the ex-ante heterogeneity is represented in red for these two types. So agents choose the consumption of necessities and luxuries to maximize their utility. They're subject to the standard budget constraint, and the parameter, their fee, captures this differential rate of return that I mentioned in the previous slide. And the law of motion for their idiosyncratic productivity is also standard. It's AR1, and they're going to differ in the mean of the process. And this is also to capture the fact that high-skilled workers have higher income, and they're more exposed to the aggregate TFP shock. So for the preferences, I choose this particular form of non-homothetic preferences, which are separable. So this is different from the last paper. And here it's very simple because I have these two parameters on the income elasticities, eta and epsilon. And the good thing about this structure is that from the intratemporal optimality of consumption choices of these households, we have this log linear condition that the log of the consumption of luxuries is going to be a constant plus this ratio between the income elasticities times the log of the consumption of necessities. And if this ratio is greater than 1, that's the definition of a luxury. The fact that if they are equal to 1, then we are back to homothetic preferences. And this parameter then can be estimated from cross-sectional consumption expenditure. And that's how I calibrate this new parameter of the model. So firms, as I said, are competitive, and they operate a linear technology to produce both type of goods. And here there's no segmentation in the labor market, which is going to simplify things in this model. And finally, the government, it has a constant amount of transfers. It collects the spread on the savings return, and it adjusts the tax rate every period to satisfy the budget constraint. And I also assume a particular rule for the evolution of the debt level. So finally, these are equilibrium conditions of the model. And what I want to highlight here is that the real interest rates is determined in equilibrium. So here, I assume, as I mentioned, that we have these exogenous TFP shocks, which I assume take the form of an AR1 as well. And here is the dynamics, the response of the model to a negative TFP shock of 1%. And what we have is that output falls, wages falls, you have this huge spike in interest rates, which are endogenous. We have consumption for both. This is the average consumption for each type of household. So the average consumption of low-skilled households is represented by the red line, and the average consumption of the high-skilled households is represented by the blue line. So both average consumptions fall, and in the green line, I'm plotting the difference between the average consumption between the two types, and the fact that it is going to the negative territory means that the consumption of the high-skilled workers is falling relatively more than the consumption of low-skilled workers. So consumption is less responsive for these low-skilled workers. And now to understand what is driving this consumption response, and that was my suggestion to Luis to do some decomposition following this spirit in the Hank literature. So we have the general equilibrium, consumption responses, and now I'm going to compute the response of consumption if I held the interest rate constant. So we have the same TFP shock. Income is changing for all households, but I'm keeping interest rate constant. And here I'm plotting the total consumption and the consumption of necessities for these two types of households. And what we find that if interest rates were constant, then we would have the opposite result. So here you see that the consumption of low-skilled households is responding more, is falling more to this income shock. And this is very consistent with the partial equilibrium or reduced form evidence in the empirical literature that low-skilled households are more responsive to income shock. They have lower liquidity, they tend to be more constrained, and then they respond more to income shock. And this is true in the model. So here I'm showing the general equilibrium from 2 slides ago, the partial equilibrium holding constant interest rates in the plot in the center. And in the right, this is another partial equilibrium exercise, but now I'm only changing interest rates. I'm holding income constant. And what you see here is that the consumption of high-skilled households is very responsive to interest rate changes. And this is what generates the result in general equilibrium. The fact that they are more responsive to this endogenous interest rate shock. And as I mentioned, so then the fact that high-skilled workers have endogenously higher elasticity of intertemporal substitution is key for this result. So an important aspect of the model is the endogenous response to interest rate, given that it's what is driving the consumption response of the high-skilled households. And here I'm showing the response in the model and the response in the data, and these I'm borrowing from this paper by Winberry, who estimates the interest rate, real interest rate response to an exogenous TFP shock. And then I'd like to emphasize that the model matches this interest rate dynamics. So finally, I compared the predictions of my baseline model with the standard incomplete markets model with homothetic preferences. So the response of the standard model are the bottom 2 plots in the slide. And what you can see looking at the consumption gap is that this model is unable to generate a negative response of this gap, which means that it's unable to generate a higher response of consumption by low-skilled workers. And finally, I then use this calibrated model to evaluate the welfare costs of a recession, or engineered by this negative 1% TFP shock, and welfare costs here measured as a percentage of lifetime consumption. And what I find is that the welfare cost is 3.6 times higher for low-skilled workers, and this again is despite the fact that they have more stable consumption. Yeah, I still have 2 minutes. So to conclude, I showed you evidence that low-skilled workers have lower consumption cyclicality, and this despite higher income and lower assets. I showed you the model with non-homothetic preference is consistent with this evidence, and then I evaluate the welfare cost of recessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcos. Now we have the comments by Ivan Becar.
Hello. Okay, thanks for the invitation. In this paper, Marcos makes 3 contributions. Is there a way we can have a mic so I can walk?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. You hear me? Okay. So he first documents that consumption spending is more cyclical for high-skilled workers, high-skilled households, because these households spend a larger share of their income on luxury goods. Then he incorporates non-homothetic preferences between necessities and luxuries into a standard incomplete market model to match that empirical fact. And then finally he computes the welfare cost of recession and shows that despite that fact, low-skilled workers are those who suffer most in a recession. So I must say that I really enjoy this paper. By the way, we tried to hire Marcos at PUC, and unfortunately he didn't come, but we, with that very same paper. So very, very nice empirical result. The empirical part is clean. The fight is quite striking, I believe. It seems robust. And then it makes sense, so it's pretty intuitive to go from the fact to the model. How can we match this fact? We have non-homothetic preferences with luxuries and necessities. The results all make sense. You manage to match the fact. He explains, he takes effort to explain the intuitions by running several decomposition exercises. And from what we know, so the non-homothetic preference, non-homothetic preferences are heavily used in growth literature to explain long-run facts, so structural change. Literature uses that heavily. And so what I learned from this paper is that, and from Louis' paper, by the way, too, is that non-homothetic preferences appear to be important for business cycle, for short-term dynamics, too. So very, very cool, well done. Congrats for the good paper. I have a few comments. So this is how Marcos models the non-homotheticity. And it all boils down to these two parameters, epsilon and eta. Now, you derive an intratemporal optimality condition. I believe there's a typo in the paper, but it's just for the constant term. But basically, you're then estimating this ratio here, the ratio of the two elasticities of intertemporal substitution. But you're regressing luxury consumption on income, not on consumption, not on necessity consumption, but rather on income. So of course, for poor households who don't save much and who don't consume luxuries, their income is mostly consumed into necessities. But what about for rich households who save and who also consume a large chunk of luxury? So how would the results change? You say that it's important to instrument, but how would the results change if we regressed log of CL on log of CN, as the model implies? Would be nice to have a discussion. And another comment here is that we usually, like, there's a big literature on estimating the EIAS, the intertemporal elasticity of intertemporal substitution. Generally, what people do is they regress consumption on the interest rate and see how people respond, how people's consumption responds to changes in interest rate. Here, you're actually using an intratemporal condition, static, to estimate intertemporal elasticity. So it seems not quite standard. So and then you actually estimate the ratio, and then you calibrate epsilon to match the response of the interest rate to a TFP shock. But that's not how the literature does to estimate these EIS. So it would be nice to have a discussion about that. And it got me thinking, there are alternatives to your modeling choice. So the standard Stone-Gary preferences assume a unique elasticity of intertemporal substitution gamma, but then they have a composite basket for luxuries and necessities, and this CN bar is the subsistence term. So you need to consume an amount of necessities to live, and that creates the non-homotheticity. So what would happen if you were to use this more standard form? And then there's as Luis I think also assumes, there is now, I think it's now the state of the art for non-homothecities, this paper by Coleman and co-authors, where they also have, so it allows to better fit the data. So just would be nice to have at least a discussion in your paper about how your results would change if you were to use these more standard preferences and maybe disentangle, we can generate non-homoticities without associating the elasticity, the income elasticities with the intertemporal elasticities as you argue. So, yeah. Then I guess that's my main criticism. So this paper is about business cycles. This section is about Hank, but this paper is not Hank. So you don't have a price or wage rigidity. It's a full flexible price model. So the way you engineer a recession is by means of a negative TFP shock. This creates an increase in the real interest rate. But that's counterfactual, at least in the US and maybe not in Brazil, but in recessions, real rates tend to fall because of low demand and because of monetary policy. So here I'm plotting GDP detrended in the US, real GDP, and the real interest rate also detrended. So you see that there's a positive correlation. So the interest rate the real interest rate tends to fall in recession, precisely because demand is low and the central bank is lowering the nominal interest rate. So, and that's a key mechanism, transmission mechanism in the model, because you need an increase in the interest rate to generate a response. So here, you see the interest rates going up. This is from Marco's paper, and we get the result that the high-skilled workers, blue, their consumption drops more. But if we keep the interest rate constant, the result flips. So you need that increase in the interest rate to generate your result. But again, in recessions, the real interest rates tend to fall. So my suggestion, but I mean, I know it would be kind of a big change to the paper, but would be to go Hank, assume some degree of rigidity, whether that's sticky price or wages. Then you could check whether your finding holds following a TFP shock. But I think more importantly, you could actually engineer a recession with a negative demand shock, which is a more plausible source of recessions, at least in the US, than a negative TFP shock. We still don't know what's a negative TFP shock. Whereas we have evidence that recent recessions have been caused by fall in demand. And then you could study, then an additional benefit, you could study the monetary transmission mechanism. How is monetary policy affected when we have these different households consuming different baskets? Should monetary policy respond more? Is it amplified? Is it dampened? You could also study fiscal policy if you want it. So yeah, there's minor comments here, but I think, you don't really explain why it's crucial to match the lower saving rate. So I know it's a stylized fact, but wouldn't you have that if you constrain households without this spread? You would still have that constrained household save less. So I'm not sure to which extent this spread, this heterogeneous returns are that key for the results here. Just a minor comment here. You say that you contribute to literature on the equity premium puzzle, but then you don't show anything about the equity premium puzzle, so I was a bit puzzled. And it would be nice just this is pure exposition, to have all parameters in one table. But this is really minor. So thanks, very cool paper. Congrats, I hope you publish it well.
You may reply.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ivan. Those were great comments. I have some replies. One is regarding the elasticity of intertemporal substitution and how do you calibrate this in a model, which is, I think, a very important question for any paper in macro. And the thing is, there is, as you mentioned, an empirical literature trying to estimate this, but their estimates are very, very imprecise. So they're essentially unable to estimate this parameter using time series data. As far as I know, if anyone knows any recent paper estimating the elasticity of intertemporal substitution, using changes in interest rate. That's how usually people do, actually. The results, I mean, the confidence intervals are huge, so you can go from 0.1 to 4 so the range is huge. And I actually think the fact that there is this connection between income elasticity and intertemporal elasticity, which is something very robust in the consumer theory. I think and it makes total sense if you think about that. You know, goods, luxury goods are easier to postpone. That's what I wrote in my discussion. So food consumption is very difficult. You increase interest rates, you're not going to choose how much you eat. So I think the fact that there is this connection actually allows us to estimate a very important object using cross-sectional data. And then going to your second comment, the choice of modeling. And to make this map, I'm relying on a model, and that the correct choice of model, I mean, not the correct, but there is a choice involved. And different choices of models are going to create different maps between intratemporal or income elasticity and intertemporal elasticity. So I'm very sympathetic to that, and I actually think that there is room for actually a paper trying to investigate deeper that possibilities, and if results change or not. That's something I didn't do. And then going to, I think, your comment on recessions and the fact that recessions in the U.S. have the opposite response of interest rates. And then interpretation is that those were recessions caused by demand shocks, and in the model I have only supply shocks. And what the Winberry paper shows is that recessions caused, or if you manage to estimate the effect of this negative or TFP on consumption, then it's actually positive. So you can, if it's a recession caused by a supply shock, then interest rates are going up. But I totally agree that there is this very relevant possibility of recessions being caused by demand shocks or monetary policy shocks. And I don't have that in the paper. But what I can say is that, I mean, what is a demand shock normally in our models? We model normally as a shock to the discount factor, which enters symmetrically with the interest rate. And here, because richer households have a higher intertemporal elasticity, they're also going to be more responsive to interest rate changes and to demand shock model as a shock to the discount factor. So but it's not in the paper, but I don't think you would, I mean, I think this model can account for this differential consumption through demand shock precisely because of this difference in their elasticity of intertemporal substitution. But yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Marcos. Anyone has any questions from the audience? The mic?
Thank you. Thank you, Marcos, for the presentation. I have a very similar reaction compared to what Ivan told in the discussion. I was also thinking about the role of prices here. You do assume that prices are flexible in your model, but we know for a fact that inflation can hurt different households, precisely because they consume different baskets of goods. And at the same time, probably the price stickiness of goods, of let's say food, is very different from, let's say, Ferraris or any luxury good. And particularly during recessions, my conjecture would be that the prices of apples are going to stay fixed, whereas the price of Ferraris is going to go up. So I want to hear your thoughts about that, particularly in terms of this stylized fact that you're showing about the consumption cyclicality, taking into account the potential different price stickiness.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because that there's actually evidence that in recessions, prices of necessities increase relative to prices of luxuries, because, and it makes sense through the lens of a non-amothetic model. Agents are poorer, they're not going to consume, the demand for luxury is going to fall relatively more, and then the relative prices, and that's what happened in Louis' paper when you compare tradables and non-tradables. But you're totally right that in my paper, I actually assume a very simple firm side, so that firms are linear, and there's no segmentation in the labor market in these two sectors, which implies that the relative prices are constant. And that's not true in the data. It's a simplification. It was a choice, but I agree. It's a possible interesting extension.
Okay, any more questions? No, nobody? Okay, so we proceed to the last paper. It's from Ivan Becar, Welfare Multipliers.
Hello. Okay. Hi again. So the question I'm after in this paper is, you're in a recession. What's the best way for the government to increase spending in a recession? So virtually all recent recessions we've observed in developed countries have been accompanied by increase in public spending. So generally the governments also respond by lowering the interest rates, but because of the zero lower bound, or because you're in a monetary union, or just because monetary policy is not enough, governments tend to increase spending in recessions. And they can do this in two broad ways. They can increase purchases, so that's the big G, G in GDP, that's value added, or they can raise transfers, sending money to people, to firms, workers, whoever. Most of the literature focuses on government purchases. I mean, there are a lot of papers on transfers, but they're more recent. And one reason is that in the past, this is transfer, so this is government spending as a ratio of GDP in the US. And you see that in the past, purchases represented the bulk of total spending. But nowadays, transfers represent more than half of total public spending. And you see that in recessions, so this is the financial crisis, this is COVID, the red line increases way more. So governments respond, and this is not automatic stabilizers. These are new law. This is with stimulus checks mostly, and transfers to the population to help support income in recessions. So what we do in this paper, we document some, I believe, some novel facts about government spending. In particular, we compute, we look at the incidence. So transfers, it's easy to see who benefits from the transfers. You just look at who receives them, and it's well documented. But what we do is we look at how purchases, what's the incidence of purchases? So how do you produce a public service, a public good? G, you need to spend on public workers, or you need to hire, or the government needs to actually buy stuff, purchase goods and services from the private sector. So we try to trace that money and see where the money goes and who benefits, whether that's the the high income or the low income individuals. And then we study purchase and transfer policies in a Henk model. So why a Henk model? Well, first you have nominal rigidity, the new Keynesian part, that allows you to have a role for aggregate demand policy. So if you increase G or transfers, there's going to be because prices don't fully adjust, there's going to be increase in output. But we also need to break Ricardian equivalence, because if you had only a representative agent model, then transfers do nothing. You send money to people, they are Ricardian, they know they will be taxed later, they don't respond. So we need to have non-Ricardian agents, and the way the literature does it is through, one way is through incomplete markets. So that's why the Henk framework is an ideal setup here. Then we study these two policies, purchases and transfer policies, and we look at their impact on the economy, and we conduct a welfare analysis, we're assuming we're going to start from a situation where the the level of public spending of G is optimal, meaning that at this particular level, households are indifferent between an additional unit of private good or C or public good G. So what are the main findings? We find that transfers are progressive. That's well known, so that's not a new finding actually. But what's new perhaps is the fact that government purchases, so G, is regressive. An additional dollar of G is mostly captured by the top earners, so the top 20% of the distribution. So that's for the empirical part. And I'm sorry for Luis, this was not in paper I sent you, so yeah, so you, this is kind of new stuff here. And then on the theory side, we actually uncover a trade-off between purchase and transfer policies. Basically, purchases, they enter GDP directly, so they increase output, one for one, but then there's a multiplier. So they typically raise output and employment more than transfers, which can be saved. But transfers, as long as they're more progressive than purchases, which is the case in the data, are typically going to better target the low wealth individuals, or they're going to boost consumption more. And what we find is they also boost welfare more. So welfare multipliers are different from fiscal multipliers, if you want. So simply looking at the fiscal multiplier, what's the effect of G on Y, it may be insufficient if we want to look at effectiveness of policies here. I'm going to skip the literature. Okay, so here's some few facts about government spending. So in the long run, that's a well-known fact. This is total government spending per capita in real terms in the US. So of course, economic growth and a larger role for the public sector means that total public spending increases as a share per capita, per person. But again, if I split this total spending into two, we see that transfers have increased much more. Okay, that's kind of similar to the first picture I showed you, to the point where they are now more than half of. In Europe, it's way more than that. Maybe they represent almost 2/3 of total spending. So the trend is also similar. Now, if we look at, this is long-term, if we look at cyclical aspects, so here appeared is the last two decades. So over the last two decades, they actually turn out to be 50-50 in terms of their weight in total spending. But if we look at their correlation with output, transfers are more counter-cyclical. They respond, both variables are negatively correlated with output. So when output falls, generally spending goes up. That's counter-cyclical fiscal policy. But transfers are more counter-cyclical, and they're way more volatile than purchases. So if we were to kind of try to attribute what's the share of total spending that's explained by each of the two components, depending on the method, but the vast majority of the increase in spending in recessions is driven by the increase in transfers, not purchases. And here I have an example of the last 4 recessions that happened in the US. So look at the early 1990s recession. It was a mild recession. There was only a 2% increase in real spending. Three-quarters of that were accounted for by purchases. But then it shifted quite dramatically, and we see that in the last 2 recessions, especially COVID, of course, but also the financial crisis, most of the increase in spending, public spending, was driven by transfers. Okay, so that's a picture I took. So this is a well-known fact. So I'm just here replicating. So who gets the transfers? These are the deciles of the income distribution. And as we know, so of course, transfers are Medicaid, are unemployment benefit, are food stamps, and all sorts of transfers. So they tend to disproportionately favor the poor. And that's the point of these transfers, actually, and so they're very progressive. Okay, so $1. Of course, the stimulus checks that happen. This is for all overall transfers. If you were to look at the cyclical part, for example, stimulus checks in the U.S., they were basically lump sum transfers to 80% of the population. Then the rich got zero. Now, purchases, so G, if you what's G? So G actually, almost 60% of G is the salary of public workers, okay? And then 40% is the government buying goods and services from private firms. So if we want to compute the incidence of G, we have to look at these two parts here. And what complicates matters is in the US you have these, a large chunk is spent by the federal government, whereas another part, actually a bigger part is spent by state and local governments. So what we have here in this table is, so here I use data from the CPS, Current Population Survey. So these are statistics for all workers in the private sector in the US over the last two decades. So on average, 34% of all workers in the economy have a bachelor's degree or more, and they earn on average, they earn a median wage of $46,000. That's for public sector employees, so federal, state, and local employees of the public sectors. So on average, that's something that's also actually known. Public sector employees are more educated than private sector. They are more likely to be in managerial or professional occupation. And as a result, they earn more. Their median wage is higher, unconditional. So if we look at the distribution, so 20%, so 52% of all workers in the private sectors are in the bottom 50% of the population. That's kind of normal. But in the public sector, only 35% of public workers are in the bottom 50%. And 65% of the public workers are in the top 50%. For income shares, so in all public workers, so the bottom 50 captures 18% of the total income, whereas in the public sector, that's less. So you see that if we were to plot the distribution, the salaries in the public sectors are skewed towards more higher wages and higher income people. Now the middle column here are firms. So we use data from USA Spending Gov. So firms that sell to the government. And then we match these firms by sector and firm size. So these are firms that sell to the federal government. The firms that sell to the federal government tend to be bigger and tend to pay higher wages and to hire more educated workers. So here the same figures apply. So firms that sell to the government are even more unequal than all firms in the economy. So putting things together, we're working on this now, but $1 of G, whether it goes to salaries of workers, public workers, or whether it goes to firms that are selling to the government, is going to be more unequally distributed than $1 of income in the economy. Okay, so takeaway here for the data. Transfers make up the bulk of total public spending. Transfers are more volatile and cyclical than purchases. Transfers are the main fiscal stabilization tool, and transfers are progressive while purchases are regressive. So now I move on to the model. So it's a standard Henk model. The only thing we add is we add G in the utility function, public goods in the utility function, and we're going to study taxes. So households care about consumption, public goods, private goods working. They consume, they save. And they have income, which is so labor income, and then this is T is a transfer, net of taxes from the government. On the firm side, it's very standard. We have sticky, here we have flexible prices and sticky wages. So the real wage is equal to 1 at all time. And we have a wage Phillips curve, so that's the source of nominal rigidity. And regarding policy, so the government spends on G, spends on T. T is transfers net of taxes, and then the government issues debt. We have a monetary policy that follows the Taylor rule with coefficient 1 on expected. So basically, here we're going to have monetary policy keeping a constant real interest rate throughout. So in this model, you can, the cool thing about Henk is that it generates so remember your ISLM models where you have the Keynesian cross, static Keynesian cross, where consumption is a function of income and transfers, after-tax income. Here, Hank does the same thing, but it's an intertemporal, so consumption, it's an intertemporal function. Consumption today depends on past income and on future income because households are forward-looking to some extent, and also it depends on past income because past savings influence consumption. So if we impose market clearing, Y is equal to G plus C, and then if we want a response of fiscal policy to, the response of output to fiscal policy, we derive this, and we have that the response of output to, depends on the response of purchases, and then we have these objects which are the Jacobian of this, the derivative of this consumption function with respect to Y, income, and with respect to T, transfers. And so these Jacobians are matrices of MPCs. So here, writing in matrix notation, output is going to increase when purchases increase, and then there's a multiplier effect. So when income increases, households consume more part of that. That's the M, that's the MPC part, and that creates a multiplier effect. So that's Keynes' multiplier effect. But transfers also, here it's negative, so I guess this is a typo, it should be positive, so here it's taxes. Transfers also increase, if you receive a transfer, you spend part of it, and that increases GDP. So these matrices are matrices of intertemporal MPC, so we can actually calibrate them, so this is just for pedagogical purposes, but only Hank models manage to, so this is the MPC that people spend in the data out of an expected income shock. So roughly they spend 50% of this income in the first year, then they spend 20% the second year, and so on. And here we see that so representative model don't match the data. Tank do a little bit better, but only Hank can have this, match this intertemporal MPC profiles. So for our purposes, when you increase G, you're going to have an impact on output, and there is a response, an impact on consumption too, that's going to depend on these intertemporal MPCs. When you increase T, you only increase output through consumption because G is constant. And it turns out that you just have to compare these matrices M and MT, so M being the response of consumption to a change in income, MT is the response of consumption to a change in transfers. And so in this model, if the two matrices are, coincide, the response of consumption following transfers is the same as the response of consumption following purchases. So this means that when transfers have the same incidence as income, when they're as proportional as income, then the consumption response across the two policies is the same. But what we show in the paper is that when transfers are more progressive than the income in the economy, then consumption following transfers increases more. And that's going to have a major role on welfare. How much do I have? How much time do you have?
3 minutes.
Okay. So I want to show you simulations. So okay, I'm going to show you simulations before my time runs up. So here, what we're doing is we're raising. We're raising G, blue, okay, purchases, and we're 1% of output during 1 year and then 0. And we're also raising transfers. When the transfers are proportional, so the rich people get a higher transfers, then as we show, the consumption response is the same, and therefore output so purchases generate a larger increase, but welfare-wise, the two policies generate the same welfare response. Now, if we have lump sum transfers sending a check to everybody, the same check to everybody in the population, then the consumption, because you're sending more money to the poor, they respond more, they have a higher MPC, so aggregate consumption will respond more. And welfare now is in favor, this is welfare blue minus red, so now you increase welfare relative to the case where you were sending a proportional transfer. So bottom line here, if you send a transfer that is progressive, you boost consumption more than if you were to do that through purchases, and you boost welfare more, at least in this model here. So here purchases across the wealth distribution. Purchases are proportional. We're working on a version where we'll make them regressive as in the data, but here they're proportional, so they tend to raise the consumption of the poor a little more, but they raise income roughly the same across distribution. Same goes for proportional transfers, but uniform transfers, so here lump sum transfer, the same to everybody, is going to give way more income to the poor as a share of their initial income, and therefore leads to a much bigger response of consumption of the poor. So that's what's boosting the aggregate response of consumption, and that's what's driving welfare here. I forgot to mention that here's a utilitarian welfare plan, so everybody counts the same, but households have a higher marginal utility of consumption, way more. So again, so purchases are going to raise consumption only indirectly through consumption, whereas by sending money to people, you're actually increasing you're increasing their disposable income, and so there is a direct effect too. And again, if you have uniform transfers, there's a much bigger effect. So the direct effect becomes bigger. Okay, so I have 20 seconds. So we have an extension. We have an employment and we have two assets, so I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, but basically we find the same, yeah, okay, I'm going to conclude. So, takeaway, if you increase, so takeaway, transfers have become government's preferred fiscal stabilization policy. Perhaps the reason I don't know, but it's because they're easily implementable, but for sure they are more progressive, so they enable to target the low-income individual that suffer more in recessions more, and then so Hank theory backs this choice in the sense that it implies that transfers are more effective at boosting the consumption, and also we show investment in the extended model, and therefore they manage to improve welfare more relative to purchases. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Now Luis is going to comment your paper.
Thank you for letting me discuss to this amazing paper. I will start by summarizing the paper in a nutshell. So the main one part of or the main motivation for the paper is the authors observed that during the time there is an increasing role for fiscal transfers, while government purchases are less used. The question that motivates the study is, what is the best way to increase the government expenditure during the recessions? This is a quite relevant policy question that is important for policymakers and also in academic debates. The key finding of the paper is that there is a very interesting trade-off between purchases and uniform transfers. Basically, purchases do a better job raising the total output, while transfers are best to stimulate consumption and investment. This result also replicates when they analyze the difference between fiscal multipliers and welfare multipliers. Transfers do a quite better job in improving welfare multiplier in comparison to fiscal transfers. So let me start with some comments about this paper. The first one is about in the version that I read of the paper, there was the main part of the transfers were through taxes that were taken off from the state. So basically similar to a tax that is replaced in the income of the household. So for me, one of the questions that appears in the application of this type of transfer is, what about if we compare directly consumption in the consumption taxes and then take off the consumption taxes? This is particularly relevant for wealthy households, because when the government gives transfer to wealthy households, they basically don't spend the money, they save the money in comparison to low-income households. So if you give the transfer directly through a consumption tax that then is taken off from household, can be another way or an extreme case in which we want to incentivize high-income household to spend the transfer. In a similar venue, we can think about this from the firm perspective. So instead of directly giving the transfer to rich household for the saved, you can give directly a bonus stimulus to the firm in order to invest, and you overpass the direct effect through the transfer. I think though, maybe a combination of those two targeted policies can help you or give an extreme case of what happens when you give directly the transfer to the agents to spend the money. So maybe this can be a way to approach to optimal policy that is way difficult to analyze in Hank models. Then the second comment is you show a lot of evidence that the transfer are quite progressive instead of purchases that are quite regressive. And then in the analysis, you follow that pattern, but maybe we can think about the other extreme case in which you have a government that is more, or in practice, some government cannot give progressive transfers, or for instance, consumption taxes are usually the most regressive way of giving transfers to the household. So maybe these other extreme cases, going from one to the other extreme of the distribution in order to stimulate the consumption, can be another way to analyze that. And then the third point is, this is something new that you show now, so this is a question that you partially answer is are those results valid household by household? Because you show results at the aggregate level, but we can think about the two extreme cases, low-income household versus high-income household, and how they behave, those policies across the entire income distribution. Then a third comment is, for me, was the main objective of the analysis was related to how to stimulate the results during the recessions. But if we think about this analysis during expansions, it's quite difficult to understand, because if you want to stimulate the economy, you can infinitely stimulate the economy by giving government purchases. And where is the cost of the government to... I know that in practice there is a cost in terms of inflation, that the Latin American economies has a lot of those experiences, giving a lot of government purchases or transfers, increase inflation. But in practice, in the model, how do you compare your results in expansions? The same applies for. I know that part of the analysis is if this is finance with debt or not, but you can think about a government with a high level of debt. For instance, the US has more than 100% of the GDP. What happened in those contexts? And a related or more general question in all of those situations is, what is a state dependency of the results, more in general terms. And my final comment is related to the size dependence of the stimulus. There is recent evidence by Brian Sorcy that marginal propensities to spend can be transfer size dependent. So basically, if you give to the low-income households, $300 is different if you give them $2,000. Basically, 300 you spend immediately, but 2,000 is not that true. So, what is or how those results behave when you have this type of size dependency in your marginal propensities to consume? So this is my final comment. Again, this is a great paper. We really will achieve the different results. A key contribution for policy analysis, this trade-off between government purchases and uniform transfer is very important, because at the end of the day, you have to decide if you want to increase welfare or stimulate the output. So very considerable implications for policy analysis of your analysis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Luis. Now, Ivan may comment.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, Luis. Yeah, very good. The recession, the state-dependent comments, very point taken. We're going to try to do this, engineer recession, and then, because right now we're doing all starting from steady state, so we can have a recession and then have the response of fiscal policy, and this should, of course, here the model is linearized, so I wouldn't expect too much of a difference, but we can still do that. I think it's a good comment. And regarding the size of transfer, that's something we thought about. So if you were to give a very big transfer to poor households, they cease to be constrained and their MPC drops drastically. So you cannot transfer 10% of GDP to everyone. I mean, you have to. We're doing small shocks here. So yeah, in that case, maybe a combination of different instruments, tax reductions and transfers could be the optimal policy. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, anyone has questions? First here and then over there.
Thank you for the presentation. Just have very small questions. One is, how do you factor in labor supply, the effect that transfers have on labor supply? Because that could make further the effect that transfers have on output compared to what government spending has on output. The other aspect is related also to this size dependence or non-linearity, especially the way that you motivate this paper, which is that there's research about the impact that transfers had on prices, especially during COVID, and how that may also affect welfare of those said households at the end.
Very good question. So transfers, because they raise income, they generate a positive income effect, they tend to reduce the labor supply. So typically firms will have to increase the wage to have households work more. So in that respect, transfers are more inflationary than, for example, consumption tax cuts. So that's something, and that's what we observe in the model. And then in reality, we saw that indeed there was a burst of inflation following the transfer policies. Of course, it was also COVID, reopening of the economy, hard to disentangle, but we definitely saw some households working less and spending more, and prices went up. So this is something we should take into account too.
Okay, the second question. Yes, you may ask.
Do you hear me? Yeah. So now, first of all, compliment for the paper. Is super interesting, this new concept of welfare multiplier. I have, however, just one big concern. So your analysis, basically, the point is that, okay, transfers are progressive, government spending appears to be recessionary, so the people that perceive the money from government spending have lower MPC. Bottom line, you get lower welfare multipliers if you give money through government spending G. Now, what I don't understand is that most of government spending does not necessarily entail, that, okay, you want to increase the number of government employees, but these government employees appear to be higher educated and so perceive higher income, and so they have lower MPC. But, you know, it might be more, you know, conceivable to me that in a recession, you hire somebody from the unemployed. And I mean, unemployment is totally not discussed here, so I was thinking about how we should think about this. On the other side of G, procurement spending. So procurement spending also has been shown to reduce unemployment and increase labor force by increasing new entrants into the labor force, which might have much higher effects than simply, you know, raising consumption through lower income households. And they also be maybe more pervasive in terms of input-output connections. You award the prime contract to Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin is gonna, you know, inputs from many other companies, which in turn may also increase their number of employees. And now, if we think about, okay, that we're not giving the money to the persons that are already working for this company or are already unemployed, but you're just reducing unemployment, then I don't know, this may have bigger consequences for like the paper. So I was, you know, just thinking about this margin that is not discussed in the paper. Thank you.
Yeah, very good question. Actually, I didn't have time to show, but we have an extension where we have employment and unemployment. So we have the extensive margin. And so we have this, that when government spending increases, it's mostly unemployed workers who work and not employed workers who work more. So we have the extensive margin. And we still, so we thought about that. The bottom line is that the result is dampened relative to a one asset Hank model without unemployment. So you're right, your intuition is right. We have less of a difference. And then it's a matter of quantities. But you're right, so your intuition is totally valid.
Okay, but so in the application with unemployment, you also assume that transfers reduce unemployment?
Yeah, for this we say any increase in outputs will translate into, there's an elasticity, so 80% of new hours, of extra hours are done by new people working instead of the intensive margin existing workers working more. So we're calibrating this to match the data, whether that's purchases or transfers. But purchases lead to a bigger increase in GDP and therefore a bigger increase in employment, so that's the margin.
Okay, got it, thank you.
Any more questions? No, so I invite everyone to go to the coffee break, and this session is over. A hand of applause to our presenters, please.